Picture this. You wake up, step outside your front door, and you see a woman just dancing, completely alone, right in the middle of the street. At first, it probably seems totally harmless, maybe even kind of joyful. But then hours pass, and she doesn't stop. The next day, 10 more people are out there dancing. Then 50, then hundreds. People are literally collapsing from sheer exhaustion, and some are reportedly dying right there on the cobblestones. And the craziest part? Absolutely no one knows why. Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to unpack one of history's absolute strangest, most bizarre unsolved mysteries, the dancing plague of 1518.
Now, what you need to know right off the bat is that this wasn't some scene out of a horror movie. It really happened. This terrifying, deadly event didn't start with a typical disease. There were no initial coughs, no sudden fevers. It just started with a dance. An uncontrollable, relentless physical compulsion that basically escalated into a living nightmare for an entire city.
Okay, let's dive into this. A city on the brink, 1518, Strasbourg. So back then, Strasbourg was part of the Holy Roman Empire. And let me tell you, everyday life was incredibly tough. We're talking extreme poverty, rampant disease, and severe famine. Honestly, fear kind of dictated everyday life. People were living on an absolute knife's edge of stress and misery. And it was exactly in this pressure cooker of a city that the seeds of a totally unexpected epidemic were planted.
The contagious dance. Let's meet Frau Trophäa.
So our story officially kicks off in July of 1518. On day one, Frau Trophäa walks out into the street and just starts dancing. By day two, she's still going. Her feet are literally bleeding. Her body is entirely weakened, yet she physically cannot stop. Then, just days later, dozens of people have suddenly joined her in the street. And a few weeks later, the whole situation just spirals entirely out of control. Hundreds of people are now trapped in this frantic, uncontrollable frenzy. It gets worse. Historical witness accounts describe victims as screaming while dancing. And that really highlights a horrifying contrast here. This was for sure not a celebration. This was a nightmare. The people trapped in this dance were suffering. They were collapsing from extreme exhaustion, and many reportedly died from heart failure and strokes, all brought on by just the immense physical toll. Which brings us to the deadly cure, and how the city leaders stepped in.
And this brilliantly illustrates the tragic absurdity of the situation. Because what do you do if your city is tearing itself apart with a deadly dance? Well, the authorities looked at horrific symptoms like bleeding feet and heart failure, and they came up with a quote-unquote brilliant medical prescription. More dancing. I'm serious. They genuinely believed the only way to cure the victims was to encourage them to just dance it out. They literally built wooden stages in the streets, hired professional musicians to play music, and even brought in professional dancers to keep the victims moving.
0. That is exactly how many people were actually cured by the city's intervention. By adding music and stages, they didn't cure the plague at all. They basically threw gasoline on a fire. The music and the whole spectacle of it only drew more people in, making the epidemic drastically worse. Eventually, the authorities realized their massive, horrific mistake. So they immediately pivoted and rolled out a strict 2-step plan. Step 1, ban all music in the city, completely. Step 2, physically remove the dancers from the streets and transport them to a nearby shrine dedicated to Saint Vitus. And then, well, the strangest thing happened. The mysterious dancing just slowly stopped. Just as suddenly and honestly as inexplicably as it had begun weeks earlier, the agonizing ordeal just came to an end. The streets were quiet again. But no one, and I mean absolutely no one, could explain why it started or why it stopped. For compelling theories, let's do a modern investigation. Putting on our modern detective hats, we've got 4 main theories dominating the suspects board today. First up, mass hysteria triggered by stress. Second, ergot poisoning from toxic bread. Third, religious fear causing psychological illness. And finally, the humble admission that modern science still doesn't fully understand it. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is looking at mass hysteria. Remember those terrible conditions in Strasbourg we talked about? The famine, the disease, the crushing poverty? Well, historians argue that this immense stress could have triggered a collective psychological break. Essentially, a shared mental collapse that manifested as this uncontrollable urge to dance. But then, we have a biological suspect, ergot poisoning. So ergot is this type of fungus that can actually grow on damp rye bread.
If you eat it, it's highly toxic and can cause hallucinations, severe physical spasms, and violent involuntary movements. It's a really compelling scientific explanation for why these people's bodies were moving completely without their consent.
So the crucial point is, we hit a bit of a wall here. See, mass hysteria explains how it spread, right? But maybe not the fatal endurance. Ergot poisoning explains the spasms, sure, but the fungus usually cuts off blood flow, which would make sustained dancing physically impossible for weeks on end. The truth is, neither the psychological nor the biological suspects flawlessly explain every single detail of this event.
Which means it is still a mystery today.
More than 500 years later, this remains a totally cold case. Just think about that for a second. Half a millennium has passed. Hundreds of people danced until their feet literally bled. Some reportedly died right there in the streets of Strasbourg. Yet the dancing plague still holds on to its secrets as one of history's most bizarre mysteries.
So I want to leave you with a bit of a provocative thought. If a huge crowd of people walked into a city street tomorrow and just began an uncontrollable, unending, deadly dance, would our modern science finally be able to explain it? Or would we find ourselves just as helpless as those authorities back in 1518, watching another unsolved mystery unfold? Thank you so much for exploring this fascinating historical dark spot with me in this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I'll catch you next time.